Welcome everyone to the second meeting of the Conference on the Crisis of Responsiveness and the Stretching of Populism in Latin America in Comparative Perspective. We had a fantastic panel last Friday, and we have now the second panel next Friday. Let me start with announcements. Next Friday, we will not have a panel. There will be an interruption. And then we will meet again on February the 19th, Friday, February 19th, for the third panel, which will feature Ken Roberts, Ernesto Calvo, Amy Erican-Smith, and Eduardo Moncada as the discussant. So remember that next Friday, there's no meeting. Today, we have our second panel, and we have the pleasure of have a fantastic group of panelists and an extraordinary discussant. Let me introduce the panelists to all of you who, in case you don't know some of them, although I assume that you know all of them. We will have with us Federico Finkelstein, who's a professor of history at the New School for Social Research and the Eugene Lang College, and he's the director of the Jaime program in Latin American Studies at the New School. Professor Finkelstein is the author of 7 books on fascism and populism, dirty wars, the Holocaust, and Jewish history in Latin America and Europe. His most recent books are A Brief History of Fascist Lies and From Fascism to Populism in History. He's also a contributor to major American, European, and Latin American newspapers and media. We also have with us Claudio Lomnis, who is the Campbell Family Professor of Anthropology and Director of the Center for Mexican Studies at Columbia University, and he's also an elected member of Mexico Colegio Nacional. Professor Lomnitz is committed to contributing to bringing the historical social sciences into public debate. His most recent books include Nuestra América, My Family in the Vertigo of Translation, Death and the Idea of Mexico, and The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón. He's a regular columnist in the Mexico City newspaper, La Jornada, and an award-winning dramaturgist. I think that's one that's hard to emulate, Claudio. You know, we don't write plays, the rest of us. Graciela Montaldo is a professor in the Department of Latin American and Iberian Cultures at Columbia University, who specializes in modern Latin American culture with a focus on contemporary cultural practice, cultural industries, and institutions. Her more recent books include Museo del Consumo, Museum of Consumerism, Rubén Darío, Viajes de un Cosmopolita Extremo, and Zonas Ciegas, Populismo y Experimentos Culturales en Argentina, among many other single author and edited volumes. Her current research explores the culture of the clandestine or underground as a political tool in modern Latin America. The last panelist is Galia Solomonov, who's an associate professor of professional practice in architecture at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at Columbia University, where she teaches advanced design, housing design, and lectures on art, housing, and Latin American architecture. Professor Solomonov is also the founder and principal of Solomonov Architecture Studio, an award-winning firm established in New York in 2004. Her work has been dedicated to integrating contemporary art and architecture and has worked with over 40 internationally recognized artists designing site-specific, multimedia, and temporary exhibitions. With artist Robert Irwin, Galia converted a 1929 Nabisco factory into the Dia Beacon, which won many international awards. Her more recent projects in making art accessible to all publics include designing the Art Alliance in Philadelphia, the Children's Museum of Manhattan, and the Underline in Miami. And finally, we have as a discussant another fantastic scholar, Amy Chaskell, who is the Bernard Hirschhorn Associate Professor of Urban Studies at Columbia University. She's a historian of Brazil, working on the urban humanities, law and society, crime and justice, policing, slavery abolition, and post-abolition societies in the Atlantic world. She's the author of Laws of Chance, Brazil Clandestine Lottery, and the Making of Modern Public Life in Brazil, and the co-editor of the Rio Reader, History, Culture, and Politics. Thank you to all of you for having agreed to be here with us. And we will give 10 minutes to each of the panelists to present their work. The papers were already distributed. For those of you who are in the Zoom, please use the raise your hand function when you want to ask questions. I will be coordinating. For those of you who are in the Facebook Live, please write your questions in comments, and Monica will be sending those to me, and I will be passing them to the panelists. Thanks to everyone. We will start with Claudio.
Thank you, Vicky, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion. I'm not myself the author of any academic work on populism, but because I write regularly in the press, I've written op-eds that deal with the subject. So that's the kind of work that I'm sharing with you today. An op-ed that I wrote for the journal Current History, which is going to be appearing in the next week or two, and I think is an example of the kind of thinking that I've been doing, even if it's, as I said, in a non-scholarly genre. So I'll read the op-ed as my intervention. So the subject is on Mexican time, on the structure of temporality in AMLO's government. My father was a seismologist, and one of his favorite anecdotes from grad school concerned one of his professors, Charles Richter, who together with Benno Gutenberg created the famous Richter scale. According to my dad, whenever there was a good strong earthquake somewhere, Richter would run to the seismographs excitedly, rubbing his hands together and exclaim, "Business is good." The lesson that disasters are relative and the lesson was that disasters are relative and that one's personal tragedy is another person's business. Andrés Manuel López Obrador's historically obsessed presidency has put many historians in Richter's position. Mexico's leader constantly alludes to one historical grievance or another. Indeed, his government has cast itself as the culmination and resolution of the great struggle of the Mexican people. This conceit of national redemption might help explain why the president, whose grandparents came from Spain, felt authorized to demand that the Spanish monarch apologize for the conquest. AMLO is there to redeem all of the nation's past wrongs. Rarely has a president been so confident of making history. From the day of his inauguration, AMLO announced the dawn of a new era, one that he called the fourth transformation. National time, as it has long been taught in Mexico's school books, provides the relevant framework for such a formula. The so-called first transformation corresponds to national independence, 1810 to 1820. The second transformation to the wars of reform and against the French intervention ended in 1867, whereas the third transformation refers to the Mexican Revolution in 1910. AMLO thus cast himself as the leader of a movement that is the culmination and synthesis of a national historical dialectic. The world historical currents that should help the nation's citizens get a handle on what is actually going on in Mexico today are thereby minimized or ignored. Rather, López Obrador is insistently and self-consciously provincial. He believes that each country should mind its own business. This quite popular anti-imperialist stance allows the president to channel the local effects of global economic processes into a self-serving and conveniently prepackaged nationalist rhetoric. For instance, the government-led process of emancipation that is supposed to be taking place before our very eyes identifies neoliberalism as its antagonist, and the government emphatically frames itself as neoliberalism's opposite, whatever that may be. At the same time, AMLO is always at pains to identify neoliberalism with what he calls neo-Porfirianism. He actually wrote a book about that, in reference to the modernizing dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, 1876 to 1911, thereby shoehorning neoliberalism into national time. So for AMLO, Porfiriato is to the revolution as the neoliberal era is to the fourth transformation. Since Mexican history textbooks have cast Diaz as a villain and the leaders of the revolution as heroes, AMLO's cyclical view of national time places his movement squarely on history's right side, while all of his opponents are neatly identified as defenders of a corrupt ancien regime. In other words, neoliberals today are porfiristas of more than 100 years ago. In López Obrador's capable hands, national time has proved to be an efficient political instrument, but it can't do much to change Mexico's position in the world economy. National time is instead a device that serves to organize the internal political field into friends and enemies. AMLO claims that before his election to the presidency, Mexico had been ruled by the PRIAN, his mocking combination of the acronyms of the two parties that had taken turns governing Mexico since the country's democratic transition, the PRI and the PAN. Thus, he collapses any party that lies outside his coalition into an all-embracing ancien regime, even while the National Regeneration Movement, Morena, the party that he created shortly before the 2018 elections that took him to power, is teeming with old, indeed often very old, ancien regime cadres. His governing coalition has such strange bedfellows as the Workers' Party, PT, which sympathizes with North Korea, among other things, the notoriously corrupt and not at all Green Party, and the socially conservative Evangelical Social Encounter Party. This is all now part of the Pueblo Bueno, all of that. The political field is thus reduced to a confrontation between the two contrasting pedigrees, that of the eternal enemies of the people and that of the people. This simple operation allows AMLO to label his opponents as conservatives, regardless of the content of their dissent from his policies, while his allies are part of El Pueblo Bueno, the good people, so long as they toe the party line. In today's Mexico, feminists, anti-militarists, and environmentalists have been called conservatives, lumped together with the Catholic right, while tycoons of dubious ethics, such as the TV and migrant remittance mogul Ricardo Salinas Pliego, have taken their seat alongside El Pueblo Bueno. AMLO has conferred upon himself the authority to pardon past wrongs and to welcome old strays back into the fold of the good people, which explains why and how a number of old-time PRI operators, such as Manuel Bartlett, now director of the National Electric Company, have been offered positions of power. There's nothing especially original in much of this. Populism relies on the opposition between an honest and oh-so-national and well-meaning majority and a minuscule, rootless, and unpatriotic elite. It is by now a well-known political strategy that that is oriented to taking power and subsequently to organizing the political field into friends and traitors, or adversaries, as AMLO most often calls them. Yet this adversarial strategy is one of the few props that the Mexican government can rely on at this time. Many of AMLO's campaign promises have failed to materialize. Rather than achieving the promised GDP growth of 4% per year, the Mexican economy contracted a bit during his first year in office, it's 2019, even while the US economy grew at around 3%. And up until that time, the Mexican economy, and since NAFTA, the Mexican economy had more or less tracked the US economy in terms of growth. And it has tanked since the onset of COVID-19 with 8.5% shrinkage of GDP for 2020. Also, contrary to any other left-leaning government that was in what was once called Latin America's pink wave, AMLO has promoted stringent budget cuts in the public sector, even during the course of the pandemic. His government has invested in three areas: direct cash transfer programs, the flailing national oil company Pemex, which has become his obsession, whose constantly mounting debts might drag down Mexico's sovereign credit rating this year or next, and the military, which has expanded vastly. And despite its investments in the latter, the AMLO government has failed to rein in violence and general insecurity, which was another key campaign promise. Meanwhile, its management of the pandemic has been pretty much on par with that of the United States and Brazil's disastrous examples. And taken together, all of this adds up to a very complicated political situation with reduced institutional levers for processing a dizzying variety of social conflicts, ranging from Me Too to environmental protests to the movement led by the families of the 78,000 and counting Mexicans who have disappeared since the start of the drug war in 2006. The bipolar rhetoric produced by a simple manipulation of the national epic helps make the disparate foci of discontent somewhat more manageable. For now, at least, the hackneyed national mythology with its eternal good guys and bad guys gives at least some semblance of order to the inchoate rumble of concerns that resound across Mexico's fractured and economically depressed geography. The iconography that accompanies this strategy is also old school, as one might expect. Upon taking office, AMLO changed the logo of the federal government, replacing the seal bearing an eagle and a serpent with an image of 5 men. Yet another instance of nationalism's hopeless entanglement with patriarchy. These men are, from left to right, José María Morelos and Miguel Hidalgo, representing the so-called first transformation, Benito Juárez, representing the second transformation, and Francisco Madero and Lázaro Cárdenas, representing the third transformation. The sequence—
Claudio, there are more than 10 minutes, sorry.
Okay, so I'll end basically saying that the point of what I'm saying is that the adoption of national time as the narrative in which to frame the contemporary events from the time of the takeover of the AMLO's triumph, electoral triumph, is very useful for organizing the political field, but it's not very useful for actually dealing with any of the major social problems that are there, and or even naming what it is that's going on. For example, in March of 2019, that is 3 months after taking office, AMLO declared that neoliberalism was over in Mexico, and then he turned around and basically negotiated the whole immigration policy with regard to Central Americans in Mexico with Donald Trump in exchange for the passage of the new version of NAFTA, Uzmeca. So we have no neoliberalism and the defense of the North American trade agreement at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Galia, you go next, please.
Okay, I will share a screen.
Please. Yes, thank you, Claudia.
Mm-hmm.
So, Vicky, I have 5 points. If I'm over time, I'm going to talk about 3 points. So, thank you very much, Vicky Murillo and everyone at ILAS for organizing this. As Vicky said, I'm an architect, not a historian or a social science expert. And so I'm going to discuss 5 points. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So the first point is the issue of the large American city. So in this brief presentation, I will outline 5 points about the Latin American cities that I consider relevant to the discussion of contemporary protests. The last years have seen a wave of protests across Latin America, some more violent than others. The protests have a wide range of demands. Austerity, they protest austerity measures, corruption, ask for fair jobs, they cry inequality, demand the rights of indigenous people, equal rights for women, sometimes erupt in surprising fashion out of seemingly insignificant hikes in mass transit cost or additional incremental taxation or tariff or layoff or rent increases. In this presentation, I will refer to protests without characterizing them as populist or not. I will leave that to you, my colleagues in the social science. I will concentrate instead on a few aspects about where these protests happen. What is it about large cities in Latin America that makes them either protest-prone or protest-ready or protest-possible. These protests happen in specific places, in particular areas of particular cities, and although it will take a much longer meeting to discuss all the specifics, I will put some piles on the ground and describe some of what I see, of why this happened here. The large city in Latin America. So it can be said that the cities are our best creation, maybe the most lasting too. The places where most things are invented, very different people mix and engage, and where the majority of goods and services are traded. The UN asserts that at present, more than half of the world population, 3.3 billion people, live in cities. Cities are also our most sturdy constructs. They have tremendous capacity to survive wars and wholesale transformations. They're constantly rebuilding, adapting, and upgrading. Damascus, for example, is one of the oldest cities continually occupied in the world. It has been in constant inhabitations since 10,000 BC and is currently undergoing, and hopefully will survive, a grueling 10-year conflict. The city, the polis, the civitas, is the physical construction of our politics. The city is actually politics in built form.
Okay, so let's start.
Sorry. Okay. They cannot be, the city is politics in built form. The hierarchies, the priorities, the institutional order, the formal and the informal, our beliefs of what is public and what is public, it's all explicitly there. Cities are open and complex contracts. They cannot be fully controlled by a leader or an entity or even armies for too long. Admire cities like London, New York, Beijing, Mexico DF, Rio de Janeiro balance a sense of control with the reality of openness, in an order closer to chaos theory than grids or networks. Their uncontrollable nature is in part given by the fact that cities today act as frontiers. As Saskia Sassen proposes, the city is a kind of frontier space. I ask myself, what is a frontier in today's world? And 20 years ago and 30 years ago, we would have said that the global south was a frontier. We do not have their frontier anymore because all that line, whether it's Africa, whether it's Asia, whether it's Latin America, it's bought up and it's controlled. So then, where is the frontier? I think right now in our world, in our Western world, the frontier space is our big cities. Frontiers, now it's me, frontiers of the new, frontiers where people come from non-cities or other cities, settle, struggle, acquire knowledge and give themselves as human resources. In return, the comers to cities develops a culture, a history, and an economy where it did not exist before. Today in cities, our large, messy, somewhat anarchic cities, where that possibility of gaining complexity of one powerlessness and leaving a historic trace in them. Urban governments cannot fully control such a diversity of peoples and engagements. The complex city, the city that is a bit messy, the city that has inequalities, the city that is not perfect, that kind of city is one of the few places where those without power can actually make a stand and say, this is my city, estamos presentes, we are here. So we have in Latin America many cities over 20 million people, and some cities over 15 and 10. The law of the Indies. Most of our Latin American cities were built upon the laws of the Indies of 1573. This incredibly detailed document lists 148 points to follow when establishing cities in the New World. Of particular interest today are 2 points. Point number 112, the main plaza is to be the starting point of the town. If the town is situated in the seacoast, it should be placed at the landing of the port, but inland it should be placed at the center of the town. The plaza shall be rectangular and should have at least 1.5 its width for its length, as much as this shape is best for fiestas, in which horses are used, or for many other fiestas that should be held. The document in its entirety, it's both incredibly pragmatic and open. These points in particular reveals to me a thoughtful consideration of location, orientation, and form as 3 factors together that give place to the plaza and the city. This plaza becomes a dominant urban void, something that can be filled, something where things can happen, something open. Point number 126. In the plaza, no lots shall be assigned to private individuals. Instead, these shall be used for the buildings of the church and royal houses and for city use. This point to me is an entry into a system, a political system where position and size manifest the political order. The void of the plaza is to be surrounded by no private building, as to retain the centrality of what cannot be bought. The objective of providing a place for fiestas in 1573 and writing it into law seems both visionary and practical. It includes an open variable into the plan of the city. The directives of the Central Plaza were followed for Panama, for Caracas, for Buenos Aires, for Santiago de Chile, Santiago de Cuba, and many other cities in different parts of the continent. Neither Boston nor New York have these as a primary foundation. Already, okay. So I'm going to jump to
9 minutes. You have 1 minute and a little bit more.
Okay, so I'm going to jump to the last point, the epicenter of protests in Latin America, and the type of protest, not from the political stand, but kind of as a formal understanding of the protest. So since the body becomes the only weapon or the primary weapon, I would like to mention 3 types of protests that have appeared in the last years. The cacerolazo. So of course, protests are ongoing in the world for centuries, but there are some interesting new colors or variations to protests. And there's 3 in particular that I believe are new. The cacerolazo, in which people use kitchen utensils to summon themselves to street and to organize themselves. The scratchy, so and the piquete. So let me get to those 3. So the piquete is well, you all know what the piquete is, but just in case, it's a line, it's a human line on a major city artery that it's prepared to stop traffic with their bodies. And so a line of usually young men stand with the marchers behind. It takes from previous manifestations, I think from sports. It really reminds me of the way streets are interrupted after games. And also the idea of the cookout that relates to the protest and occupies the city and the city street to create a place of food and replenishment. And then the other one is the scratche, that is the protestation, yes, I'm finishing the protestation by creating an uncomfortable situation to somebody that is considered not to have followed the law, and then the cacerolazo, which is followed now throughout all the states in Latin America. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Galia. Graciela. Where is Graciela? Oh, there he is.
Hi, thank you, Vicky. Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing all the events ILAS have organized during the last year, in the pandemic year. So in this conversation, I would like to reflect on some of the effects of the politics of populism and its impact on Argentine culture. I do not mean to propose a political definition or to consider its manifestations in art and culture. I think the critic George D.D. Uberman has already provided an apt description of the ways of representing the people in art and literature. And I quote, "When the people means the unity of the social body, they represent the nation. But when it denotes the swarming mass of the lower strata, its figuration becomes a site of inextinguishable conflict." I agree with this description. Here I am interested in investigating how culture functions in certain populist contexts. I don't want to talk about the populist culture, but about what happened to culture under populism. I want to focus on cultural functions and processes rather than the agency of the subjects. Culture functions historically in parallel with politics, establishing different relationships with it. I think that in a discussion of populism, the first thing that comes into focus is the relationship between culture and politics, especially the relationship between culture and the state. Simplifying the problem, I would say that in liberal democracies, modern culture has operated through two basic modes of intervention. On the one hand, culture has served to reproduce the political system by affirming the politics of the state. That is what is commonly called hegemonic culture. This is a way of uniting citizens under a system of discipline and regulating of the intervention of subjects. As an example of liberal culture, we have the canon of Latin American thought from Domingo Faustino Sarmiento to Mario Vargas Llosa, which imposed its ideas and values disseminated through the national school system, the media, cultural institutions. On the other hand, there are more complex responses which can be broadly characterized as form of active resistance to the hegemonic culture and to the authority of the state, institutions, and the market. Resistance can be expressed in many ways. There is resistance to the system through the form of the avant-garde or experimentation, which criticize cultural institutions as a whole. And there are more institutional forms of resistance, such as projects of proletarian cultures that contest the ownership and use of the means of cultural production, although they have not always contest the values of bourgeois culture. In Latin America, we have examples of this form throughout the 20th century. There are the anti-establishment movements like Brazilian modernism and the movements of the 60s, the cinema of Glauber Rocha or Raúl Ruiz, Rodolfo Walsh writing or artistic interventions like Tucumán Arde. And as an example of the second tendency, we have the initiatives of the Teatro del Pueblo and other forms of proletarian cultural intervention that were ideological, opposed to the dominant cultures. Summing up, in modernity, culture has functioned in two ways. On the one hand, it has operated in the service of the reproduction of a system. On the other, it has tried to change it, transform it, and create alternative systems. The history of the West is full of conflict between these two forms. In this context, populist politics introduces a difference that interrupts this binary system. What is particular to culture under populism, I think, is that the reproduction and resistance come together. Culture must act for and against the system at the same time. Maybe AMLO is an example of it. For it, because it must be allied with the state, which is identified with the people. Against it, because it must promote form of resistance and questioning of the knowledge and practices of the liberal tradition of the elites. In this way, culture at once supports and criticizes social values. It is located within and outside the system. It interpolates society with a double code. And I would also add that in populist regimes, the political is present in every moment of cultural experience. In reality, the political is always present in culture, but in liberal democracies, it goes unquestioned, and institutional mechanisms tend to obscure the links between culture and politics. Culture tends to appear as an autonomous sphere of production, even when its theme is politics. Under populism, on the other hand, politics appears as that which stimulates and disrupts, and therefore it is impossible to pretend that it doesn't exist. For this reason, under populism, politics traverse all moments of cultural production and circulation. The politics-culture relationship is tagged and politicized. In cases like that of Argentina, this condition is not limited to what is produced under populist government. It is something that permeates the culture in more general terms, in different periods and under different governments. I do not mean to say that populism is everything, but rather that it generates certain conditions of cultural production in which, more or less radical, politicization touches almost all cultural actions. Under these conditions, culture must contend with difference, exclusions, tensions, must suture this difference, that is, it must address politics explicitly. This does not mean that it stages politics or that it speaks of politics in partisan terms. Sometimes it does, but in general, it doesn't. It registers the tension of a shared experience and fashions its work out of them. We do not tend to think of culture as mimetic, as the expression of a reality, but as different processes of reworking and creation of new realities. Culture does not reflect or represent, but acts politically. This is why there can be populist culture and the government that are not strictly populist. I'll consider an example. In January of 2020, there were two symptomatic cases of the use of culture in the political struggle in Argentina. The new governor of the province of Buenos Aires, Axel Kicillof, and the new president, Alberto Fernandez, made two public errors. Kicillof said "aiga" instead of "haya," in an incorrect conjugation of an irregular verb. And Fernandez mentioned Borges' novel. Borges only wrote short stories, poem, and essay. The journalist Maria Moreno wrote an article offering a controversial analysis of how both were mocked in the anti-populist media. She recalls various radio and TV characters who in Argentina history represented the uneducated, the inarticulated, the ignorant. She said that these characters were effective and successful because they, and I quote, they made knowledge, education, and a command of the convention of language, not instrument of access of or mastery, but objects of joyful perversion and irreverent mishmash. Errors are not wrong. They are right in a different way. El error no se equivoca, sabe de otra manera. Defining errors and penalizing those who make them, as we know, is an exercise of power. I think these conclusions sum up a conception of culture that cannot be equated with a counterculture, but that is opposed to and even contradict traditional culture. The norm is transgressed for the position of the state, from the position of the state. The conception of error as a form of knowledge is not new, but the celebration of its use, the picardia of interpreting error as a challenge of authority correspond to a cultural and political positioning that has been favored in populism. Something else is found in this transgression, another way of knowing that operates within the official culture, but contradicts some part of it. Well, I have no time, but this is the main idea, the way when culture works in two ways at the same time.
Thank you very much. Graciela, Federico, do you want to do the last presentation before we pass to the comments and discussion, please?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Vicky, and thank you, Ilas. It's really a pleasure to be, well, I guess here virtually. And I wanted to talk about, I mean, what can be gained by focusing on populism from a Latin American perspective, or perhaps more properly from the perspective that Latin American history offers the historian. And of course, my answer to the question is very much in the affirmative. That is to say that there is a lot to be gained, and in a way that people that are not too much into Latin American things, and specifically Latin American history, perhaps should pay more attention. Now that you know, perhaps or certainly in many ways, the Trump regime has ended. I would like to return to a very interesting quote by the former president and refer, I mean, in a moment that I'm not sure to call it of self-reflection, but at least a kind of understanding of the historical or of temporality as such. Trump defined the current moment, that is to say, his presidency, as the age of Trump. And as an historian, I was wondering to what extent he was right. I mean, how new were the new things that Trump was providing to the world? And of course, as a Latin Americanist, I also wonder how much this resembles Latin American history. And here, of course, as in all historical questions and answers, there are issues of continuity and issues of change. To some extent, to be sure, Trump was quite new, but there were important precedents behind his newness. And these precedents are related, at least in, you know, in my view, and certainly in my work, to the history of fascism and populism. Now, of course, populism, neither fascism nor populism are Latin American per se. I mean, these are concepts, ideologies, movements, and eventually regimes that spread throughout the world at different times. Now, before fascism, there were pre and proto-populist movements in the world, places like, for example, Russia or the US, and certainly Latin America. Although this is a kind of polemical take by myself, because according to this periodization, which presents a turning point in 1945, I don't see Cárdenas as a populist. I just wanted to, as we say in Argentina, to spice things up. But in any case, I would like to return to this issue if possible. But I don't want to talk about it at this point, because probably, Vicky, I have 5 more minutes, something like that.
7.
7. Oh, I'm quite rich in time then. Okay, so basically, as I was saying, although there are elements of populism that happened before 1945, populism either before and after that was often an ideology and a movement, but before 1945 was never a regime. And to the extent that there are a lot of things that happen in the world after 45, and the most important perhaps of them were the kind of combined processes of both the defeat of fascism and the end of colonization or decolonizing processes throughout the world. One outcome of all that was the emergence of populist regimes. That is to say, of populists coming to power, no longer in the context of a kind of triad between fascism or big contest between fascism, liberalism, and communism, but rather in a new context where fascism was gone in a way as an ism, and there were people that were or had been into dictatorship or even fascism before, and they wanted to somehow transform themselves into a more viable political projects. And as opposed to the fascists that, as you know, in the most famous cases of Germany and Italy, for example, destroy democracy from within in order to create a dictatorship, something that has, in my view, echoes of the last coup attempt by Trump. The populists, unlike Trump, wanted to do the opposite. They had been dictators, they had been strongmen, and they had been fascists, and or a combination of all those things. And what they did, in fact, was the opposite. In the first case, certainly not the most important one, and I want to say this in a kind of, with the exception of my my dear friend Claudio, a kind of Argentine bent panel. I want to stress this very clearly. I don't see Perón as the most important populist, period. But he was the first in establishing this new idea of what a democracy should be. That is to say, an authoritarian democracy in which there were elements of which had been dictatorial or even fascist, now adapted to electoral means. And as I said, fascists destroy democracy from within. Perón, basically, he was a strong man in a dictatorship, and he destroyed that dictatorship from within in order to create a democracy. So quite the opposite. Vargas had been a dictator, and he, he became the elected president of Brazil, and we see similar processes in countries, in a way, failed processes in countries like Peru and Colombia, and more successful processes also in Bolivia and in Venezuela. At the same time, people that had been closer to dictatorships or had supported dictatorship now engaging in a kind of combination of democracy and authoritarianism. So that's many people, I will include myself for the time being, we call that classic populism. Then populism had a big itinerary. It was not restricted to Latin America, and there were populist leaders across the world. Populists in that sense could become many things, but more or less almost never returning to these authoritarian origins in a way. And in that sense, it adopted like a kind of national popular, pseudo-left-wing takes, neoliberal takes, and many other things. Let's say from Perón and Vargas to Berlusconi, Cristina Kirchner, Hugo Chavez, and many other people, populism had been many things, but it had left behind at least 4 key elements of dictatorship and fascism. And these key elements, Vicky, what do I have? 3 minutes?
Let me see. More or less, yeah.
I'm maybe wasting important time.
2.5.
2.5. Okay, 2.5 for this. I will say 4 elements. 4 elements which are constitutive of fascism and were not constitutive of populism. In fact, populists had left this behind. They were, for someone like Perón, toxic elements. And these elements were, of course, dictatorship. The other element was racism and the politics of hatred. The other element was a kind of extreme propaganda which was typical of fascist lies. In that sense, populists, let's say from Perón to Berlusconi or Cristina Kirchner, they lie like any other politician of different traditions, rather than believing in their lies and trying to change radically the world in order to make it more relatable to the lies. And finally, they left behind violence and the militarization of politics. These were elements, and Perón himself would say that the fascists were piantavotos, and what he meant by that was that they would scare away voters. So this was kind of the populist formula, let's say, on right-wing or left-wing choices. And then there is Trump, and then there is Bolsonaro, and Salvini, and Orban. I would like to finish with this, because what we see in these kind of leaders, and perhaps in that sense, there is a new age of populism, in a way, perhaps a populism that ceases to be a populist or is at the border of, let's say, returning to a kind of fascist formation, because it returns to these 3 out of 4 elements. You know, there is no Trumpism without violence and the militarization of politics. There is no Trumpism or Bolsonarism without lies and propaganda that resemble Goebbels more than Perón and Vargas. There is no Trumpism and Bolsonarism without, so I said lies, violence, and I said racism. I will add racism and xenophobia. And the 4th element was dictatorship. And that's why I always thought that in Trump there was a danger of fascism. But with a coup d'etat, which is what it was, Trump seemed to be wanting to leave behind all traits of populism in order to become a fascist. I mean, he eventually was a wannabe fascist because he couldn't establish that dictatorship. But what we see in current populism, and certainly Bolsonaro seems to be going that way, this week also he wants to create a kind of new Brazilian man. I mean, every week there is a new fascist element to his attempts to destroy Brazilian democracy. But we see populists returning to these 4 elements, and I finish with this, to these 4 elements of fascism. So what we see is that in a way that the history of Latin America, with probably the exception of Bukele, you know, of let's say Salvadorian examples or Brazilian examples, which at this point thankfully are more exceptional, what we see is that the history of populism in Latin America doesn't explain, let's say, the ultimate outcomes of the new populism that is out there, which is a populism that is in a way not that much populist, and in a way ceasing to be populist in order to become full-blown fascist, as Trump wanted it to be, and thankfully failed. And because of that, probably we are having this conversation right now. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Federico. Amy, why don't you start with comments, and then we'll open to general discussion.
Thank you, Vicky. And thank you to Elas for organizing this and inviting me. And Vicky, I really want to thank you for keeping everything going during this pandemic, keeping such exciting programming going. I know it's not a small feat to have done that. So I'm going to offer some brief comments to draw together and maybe to go beyond a little bit these really thought-provoking papers. So I want to briefly take us back to mid-November of 2016 when it started. The gravelly sound of bumping suitcase wheels echoed in the halls of universities across the country. Historians of fascism across the world were thrust into agonizing relevance, and they packed their bags and went around the world, sharing their knowledge about how authoritarian populism begins and how it might end. For fasciologos, as for immigration and human rights lawyers, business was good, to quote Claudio's father. So of course, as historians know, every moment is a moment of transition and change, but there's something about the present moment of early 2021 that feels to me epical. So what better time than now to ask these questions that we're asking here? And this panel may be the perfect interdisciplinary assemblage of thinkers to reflect together on the stretching of populism, which is the title of this event. And what I think is meant by the stretching of populism, what I imagine it to mean is Latin American populism's continuities and ruptures, and the extent to which it is a helpful concept at all. A concept that allows us to name the political moment and to connect phenomena of popular discontent, polarization, and the strange cocktail of popular sovereignty and authoritarian rule across space and time. And I'm going to be, in thinking about these presentations together, I'm going to limit my commentary to 3 broad sets of questions. So the first one has to do with the scope and scale of the concept of populism. From these papers collectively, I'm not actually sure if a consensus emerges about whether we can talk about populism as a regional Latin American phenomenon. Federico clearly delineates such an idea. Galia suggests it in pointing to a Spanish American colonial model of the city, and maybe also in this typology that she draws here about the models of protest throughout Latin America. But Graciela and Claudio address national political culture and show how populist governance tends to be fixated on national histories. The question of how we can square the transnational and hypernational is central to understanding populism today as 80 years ago. So I would love to hear the group reflect on how or if we might understand these different levels of analysis as working together. And by different levels, of course, I mean the global, the transatlantic, the national, and the level of the city. How might thinking about different jurisdictional levels and scales of power enhance our understanding of the populist phenomenon? And more broadly, I think looking at the smaller municipal scale might help us to think about what might look, at least superficially, like ideological contradictions. And I have to, of course, own up to the fact that I am an urban historian, so I'm predisposed to looking at the urban level. But I want to hover for a minute at the level of the city. Mid-century populism focused on urban sectors, and populist political machines were often built at the municipal level. In Brazil, the first populist politician was a mayor, not a national leader. Is there a populist city? In the 1930s through the 1960s, urban centers of Latin America filled with architecture brought about by the expansion of the government machine by the turn away from Belle Epoque planning. And we see the overlaying of illiberal, liberal, illiberal, and neoliberal here. The counter-revolutionary cities of the Belle Epoque became the counter-revolutionary neoliberal cities of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And really, as a sort of aside here, I think it would be interesting to inquire into the role of academic institutions, universities, in this phenomenon of populism and how it's built in physical as well as in political space, and to reflect on universities as gateways for the oppressed, as physical spaces deemed dangerous to authoritarian politics, and as places also where political ideologies are concocted. And I think it's interesting too to think about how the city might provide a useful vantage from which to understand the strange ideological eclecticism that is a central characteristic of mid-century populist politics in Latin America. I think it's really arguably both populist politics and municipal politics show the limits of a simplistic left-right schema for understanding political doctrine as it exists in the real world. So the second of my 3 clusters of ideas is political violence. Federico points out that fascism in the Americas clearly rejected the extreme violence of its European counterparts. Why was this the case? And how do we account for the toleration of violence and the ever-present threat of it in this context? In Brazil, known for its multiple bloodless transitions, coups and revolutions and so on, under Vargas, the police pioneered the spectacular violence of political surveillance and torture, political murder, and so on. I was struck also, Claudio, in your paper, how you point out that AMLO portrays himself as the fourth of four transformations. And I noted the only one of those four that did not emerge out of a blood-soaked conflict. We need to dig more deeply into this populist insistence that violence shall be rejected, even in the face of the violent repression of political dissent, for example, under Perón and Vargas, the dramatic and ongoing militarization of policing and pervasive social violence. And my final point is about the uses of history and culture. And I'd like to raise here, just for one example to get us thinking about that, Graciela's really interesting point that she ended on about the selective criticisms of malapropism and bad grammar in contemporary political speech. Having predictable rules about how language operates is important to allow it to serve as a means of communication and also as a means of conquest. Could this selective rejection of the rules of language be an analogy of the fate of the rule of law itself under charismatic populism? So, despite the inauguration of the new administration here in the United States a few weeks ago, I'm sorry to say to you fasciologos that it's not quite time to unpack your bags yet. Business is still lamentably good. That's all.
Thank you very much for a fantastic set of comments. Why don't I give a couple of minutes to all of the panelists, and then I already have questions here, and I have also a few questions my own. So if people can raise their hands, I can start the list, and Monica also, please send them the questions in the chat to me. So do you want Claudio to start in the order you presented in reaction to Amy's comments? Claudio, oh, I lost. You're muted, Claudio.
Sure, thanks. Well, thank you for those comments. And I myself am not exactly a fasciologo, so I don't have as much to say, I think, as some of my colleagues do. So as a result, I won't say that much. I'm also not a political theorist. To me, populism is more about a technique for taking the state than a very clear distinction about what is done once you have an authoritarian turn with the state. I'm not so sure about that, although there clearly are some common characteristics, like the political use of polarization in order to simplify the political field seems to be quite common. Example of that are certain forms of plebiscitarianism, those kinds of things. Also, I'm not entirely sure about one of the things that Federico said, but he does know best. But I'm not sure about it, which is whether the nature of the lies under a populist regimes is the same as under liberal regimes. I'm not so sure about that. I think there is quite a lot of work that is done, at least in the case of Mexico today, but I think also in the case of Cristina, not now as vice president, but before, to do with fiddling with, let's say, how to measure reality and what reality is. Right now, sadly, we see this a lot with the pandemic as well, and with information around the pandemic. So I'm not convinced that the nature of lies is the same as in a liberal regime. One of Amy's questions around the rejection of violence interests me a lot, because we tend, I think, to imagine violence very much as emanating from the state, rather than looking at violence. I think it's a broader phenomenon in a country like Mexico today, or like Colombia, Central American countries. Violence is coming from lots of places. And so there's the rejection of violence is something that many of us can do verbally, but you can't, that doesn't mean that you can stop it. And on the part of the government, there's the question of governmental efficacy or lack of efficacy in reining in homicide or reining in violence on the one hand. That's one issue. And another issue is the question of militarization. I think those are sort of separate. And that is, you can have a high galloping militarization, as you've had in Mexico for the past 3 or 4 presidents, and especially now under AMLO, and still not rein in violence at all. Those two things seem to be a little bit disconnected. Finally, I think that there's some reflection on the part of those of us who have at least a foot in the historical field with regard to the teaching of history in schools and the role that history teaching has in providing a kind of a common sense that makes one of Amy's key questions, I think, very difficult to deal with in democratic politics, which is that the mythology, historical mythology, and its painstaking construction from the 20th century, and even from the late 19th century forward, in Latin America, has tended to make transnational thinking, which I think is key to understanding whatever is happening anywhere, actually viable in public discourse. And I think that there's work for historians in terms of business, where business should be good for historians, I think, should be in trying to think more seriously about the way in which history is thought of and taught and what it's for in the school system.
Thank you. Galia?
Thank you, Amy, for your reflections. I also would like to take on the point that Claudio was making about violence being something that one can be against, but one can have no say. You know, as a participant in a society, you do not have the ability to stop violence yourself. And so the sense that the threat of populist violence is it's one that it's especially painful. And I think the city, the citizens of a city have there's a sense of impotence. There's a lot of impotence over the many problems that are looming in the Latin American scenario. And I think cities provide a way to respond to some of those impotence. And so what I was trying to say is that there's a lot of creativity in the thinking of how to express grievances. And sometimes that creativity does not go into the government. The government, when a certain group takes on the government, that cannot translate that same creativity in giving a response. And I wonder why that's the case, whether are the problems so impossible to resolve? So I think that one of the things that we see is that on the one hand you have grievances and problems that arise, and the other you have an insufficient ability to respond to those problems, even when the group that is protesting assumes power.
Thank you, Galia. Graciela?
Okay, thank you, Amy, for your comments. I have some comments for the 3 of the points you mentioned. The first is the scale, the scope and the scale, the global and the national. I think from the cultural studies point of view, the national is the main point of view to see the nuance in the cultural movement in the populism. So I have the national as the main frame to think about cultural production under populism. Regarding the second point, the violence, political violence, I agree with Claudio and Galia, and I would add that during the history in Latin America, political violence is a property of the elite and not only of the populism. So we can make some nuance in this case. And regarding the third point, regarding the point of breaking the rules, in the case of my example, breaking the rules of the language, well, it could be dangerous as a model from the state, but I think in most of the cultural history of Latin America, this kind of behavior empowered the people. So yes, it's dangerous, but I think we can see the positive part of this behavior. I am not here for agree or disagree with this kind of problematic, but I think it has two phases: the phase of the dangerous breaking the rules, and the phase of empowered people.
Federico, and then we go to questions. We already have several there.
Yes, I have a short, a short and also a long answer to Claudio's point, which I think is very important. And then I would like to address Amy's points as well. The long answer is my last book. I mean, I try to demonstrate what is specific about fascist lies vis-a-vis other types of lies. But the short answer, of course, is that since politics started, all politicians lie, and politics is about lying to a big extent. On the other hand, most politicians do not believe their lies to the extent that they want to change reality in order to transform the world in accordance with their lies. And here, even in someone like, in my own work, I talk about the mythical dimensions of populism and how there is an idea about the world that often does not correspond to reality. But at the end of the day, they accept, for example, to be very specific about this, they accept the results of elections mostly, and they live. They accept that there is a disease, they might like it or not, and they get vaccinated, as Cristina did. Now, when we talk about Bolsonaro or Trump or Hitler, we are reaching a level of lies that is totally different. They believe that Jews are dirty, and because that is a lie, they change the world. They put them in concentration camps or ghettos in which they become dirty, and eventually they have to be killed. And they deny the disease, and eventually people die because of that. So in Bolsonaro and Trump, I even see kind of genocidal dimensions because of those lies. But anyway, I mean, this is I mean, at the end of the day, I want to say that I agree that I wouldn't say that the world of populism is a world of truth, but the fascist way, let's say the Goebbels way of lying, in my view, it's something else. Regarding Amy's points, I really like the question of how Latin American populism is, because in fact, in studies of populism, generally the field, as when it pertains to Latin America, it's kind of dismissed. And somebody like Rosambalón, you know, big theories of populism will say, you know, I will not talk about the Latin American classic examples, as if saying that that is Latin America somehow presents a kind of a strong wall, a divider between, let's say, the West and the rest. And in a way, you know, being from Latin America, having a Latin American perspective, and this is something that I think Claudio a long time ago, like raising one of his books, like this issue of how Western, you know, the Latin American is, and in a way, it's on the West. So the question that you start asking about the connections rather than establishing this kind of stereotypical disconnections. But again, so I would even say that my work and my approach is about, you know, trying to disentangle this idea that there is something Latin American about this. What is perhaps part of Latin American history that for a variety of reasons, the first regimes emerged in Latin America. Now, the issue of violence is central, and as I agree with everyone else here that, in fact, the populist cases are not the ones that are the most violent in Latin American history at all. Perón himself will describe his leadership as that of a vegetarian lion, a leon herbívoro, and he wanted explicitly to distinguish his regime from the fascist regimes and their violence. In fact, when they toppled him, the civilian governments and the dictatorships that happened after him were much more violent. It's not that a lot of people die under the second Vargas regime or under Perón, and so on and so forth. So the issue of violence, I think, actually is a point of demarcation, in my view, rather than a typical marker of populism. I mean, a point of demarcation between fascism and populism. Finally, well, I will stop there because there are many things to talk about also.
Thank you, Federico. I have a list of people, so I'm going to start giving them the chance to ask questions, and then at the end, or after a few of them, we'll come back to you. Cesar, you are the first.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody. I'm actually going to have one question, and it's also a question and an opportunity for Graciela to maybe talk a little bit more about this. So there was one sentence in the end of your paper that you said, I quote, I think correctly, in culture, populist governments seek a symbolic redistribution, end quote. I thought this was really intriguing, right? Because we as political scientists, we think a lot about actual redistribution, talking about a symbolic redistribution. And what I understood from this is that a populist would be trying to give the popular classes something by raising the status of popular culture, popular cultural practices. And that will be something that they can deliver to their constituents. So I wonder if this is what you meant. And if this is what you meant, is this something that can only be done by a government, or could there be a populist doing exactly the same thing out of government? Is being in government a requisite for that? And is this something that's actually done because it's central to how you see populism, or is it just like a small curtain to keep all the elitists busy while populists are doing something else? Or if you don't want to answer, just want to comment, also feel free to just comment on this sentence. It was really intriguing.
Okay. Thank you, Cesar. Let me ask a few questions first. Ken?
Yes, thanks, Vicky, and thanks, Elas, for sponsoring this very interesting conversation. I just had a point I wanted to make in response to Graciela's very intriguing comment where you were talking about how populism tends to penetrate different social spheres and to politicize things that previously were not understood to be political. And it struck me as you were saying that how, the extent to which populism in that sense is operating as the antithesis of neoliberalism and technocracy, which tend to do the opposite. They tend to depoliticize a wide range of social and economic relationships. And so they tend to narrow the public sphere and to privatize social life and to depoliticize. And so I'm wondering, is there sort of a dialectical relationship that one of the reasons why we see sort of a new wave of populism in Latin America, it's part of a process of repoliticizing a wide range of social and economic relationships that were depoliticized in the 80s and 90s in the context of the neoliberal transformation and the technocratization of Latin American societies. And then just a quick point to Federico. I really like your reflections on the relationship and the boundaries between populism and fascism. I've had to struggle with some of those questions myself. And I guess the question I would pose to you is the distinctions that you're talking about, the things that make populism different from fascism. Are these qualitative differences, differences of kind, or are these degrees of differences where fascism is the radicalization of elements that we see in populist expressions, and fascism just takes it, you know, hasta las últimas consecuencias, or whatever the case might be. So do you see these as, are these qualitative differences, or are these really just differences in degrees?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ken. Alejandro, and then I have myself on the list. Yes.
Thank you, Vicky, and thank all of you for your presentations. Can you hear me?
Can you speak louder, Alejandro? It's hard to
no.
hear you. Last time it was the same.
My microphone is terrible. I'll just project. I apologize. Yeah, thank you for all your presentations. Learned a lot. So I was struck by Amy's comment at the start that what these papers suggest is that there's no consensus about how to understand populism. But in fact, I think that more than a lack of consensus, there's a significant disagreement, which I just want to sort of put my finger on and hear it elaborated further. I mean, it seems to me that the issue that's at stake is whether or not populism has content. Where Federico explicitly articulates populism as in itself being an ideology of the expansion of the popular field, of the political field. Even though I think, Galio, you sort of suggested that might be true, this for you is a moment of danger. It's a moment of that is fraught, not only fraught with danger, but historically speaking, it leads to positions not towards the expansion of rights, but rather towards their curtailment, which I think is also where, to some extent, Graciela is landing in terms of the two-facedness of populism as both being a condition of possibility of opportunity and a condition of possibility of repression or the rest of it. So, but to me, it seems like the central difference there is whether or not we can already conceptualize populism as having an ideological form a priori, or whether it is explicitly just a vehicle that then can be molded in many different directions, in which case, I think we're just talking about populism as politics more broadly, which I know is not the point that you were trying to make, Esquerra. You were explicitly saying that you're not saying that populism is everything. So what is the thing that populism is if populism isn't everything? And I think that there's significant disagreement in that, and I'd just like to probe that a little bit further. Thank you.
Okay, I had myself next, and here I was trying to make connections between the papers and thinking exactly as Alejandro said of what is populism, and some of you give us certain answers. So if populism comes from populo, pueblo, what's interesting in Galia's story is that the pueblo had already an architectural definition at the time of colonization. Every town in Hispanic American had to have the plaza, right? And the plaza was for fiestas, so to bring the pueblo out. It's not like the salon that it's in closed doors. This is an open door space. So I was wondering if this has anything to do with Federico's story of this, the real form of populism, which surprisingly is Perón, emerging in Latin America, right? So is there anything about the way in which Spanish colonized and built the cities that make us, the pictures when I teach populism is always the picture of the Zócalo with Cárdenas, that I know you don't consider populism, the Plaza de Mayo with Perón, and so on and so forth. And I thought the plaza is very powerful because it's both the place of mobilization of populist leaders, and I want to come back to leader, and the place of pop protest that could or could not be populist. I mean, the way I see populism is people are not protesting. They are greeting the leader. There's more protest when you don't have populism, right? When the populists are out and they're protesting on the streets. And in that sense, the question I had for Galia is which, first, how you see the geography and the current of populism, and the real degree, I would push you on the protest that you consider urban. So I buy to you that the cacerolazos are urban. You need to have people around to listen. I mean, and they emerge in a very urban setting, in the protest against Salvador Allende, in the rich neighborhoods of Santiago. At least to my knowledge, that's the first time we study them. I can believe that the Scratche or the Funas, the Chilean call it, is also urban because you need people to see that you are, making shame on someone. But certainly the piquete is not urban. The modern piquete, the piquete is a very old thing, unions have always used it, but the modern piquete, according with to Auchero, at least in the 90s in Argentina, emerged in the middle of the Patagonia in a very non-urban setting. And, I study rural piquetes from landlords, and certainly not urban at all. So the piquete, it's a more flexible protest. I would not certainly call it urban. And that got me to think between urban and rural, and this is where the connection with populism comes. Rural protests, the way I see them in extractivism, for instance, in the 2000s, or even in the landlords in Argentina in the 2000s, they want the state out. These are protests kind of pushing the state out. And the urban protests, the way I see them, they're asking for the state to come in, to provide services, to provide rights. It's exactly the opposite way. So in a sense, and that's where I see populism coming. The idea of asking demands from the state seems to me, in my definition of classical populism and social redistribution, not just symbolic redistribution, an important component of my historical understanding of classical populism. And this brings me to both Federico and Claudio. And I think what I like of Federico, and I know we normally do not agree a lot on our discussions on populism, is this idea of electoral legitimacy. That's the big difference, I think, between populism and fascism, if you had to summarize it. Okay, that's fair enough. In both there is polarization, but populism wins elections. If you lose the elections, you're not really a populist, you're something else. A fascist, I'm not sure it's a fascist, but something else. But in your paper, much more than in your presentation, this popularity contest is associated to a populist leader. That wasn't true in the presentation. And a populist leader that was like AMLO in Claudio's description, a very polarizing populist leader. And I am pretty, and you said that the ideal type of populism is Peronism. Peronism really does not seem to require the leader that much. Menem was not that polarizing. He's over, he didn't die and was replaced. The current president of Argentina, who's also Peronist, is not very polarizing. I mean, I was surprised of those, of your calling Peronism populism by now, given your own definition. Now, what Peronism is, and this comes back to Claudio, is popular. How do I define popular? If you look at both propensity, the poor people are more likely to vote for Peronism. The less educated, the lower income. I mean, we might not know the ideology, but we know who's voting for them. And this is what AMLO has going for him. He might be redistributing symbolism if you want to go to Cesar, because there's no better economy. He's not giving them money. The crime is bad. Everything is bad. But he reclaims the popular identity. And there must be something that allows him to reclaim that popular identity. That, not just that the parties are really making alliances together. At this point, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD are going together in election. But the fact that he can claim to be the anti-elite and it resonates with the majority of Mexicans, there must be something there on which he's building beyond the symbolism. And so I would like you to push to reflect on that. And this brings me to Graciela's. And here is my reading of your paper. Axel Kicillof, a character that could not be more educated. He went to the Nacional Buenos Aires. You cannot be more elite than Axel Kicillof in Argentina. He has a PhD. He perfectly knows how to conjugate the verb. But if you want to make a performance to appear as a populist rather than a mistake, maybe you do conjugate in the wrong way. And then you can identify yourself as popular. I mean, that's why George W. Bush always spoke wrongly. I don't think he was, he didn't know how to speak. I do think that in your paper, you took the mistake as a mistake, and you didn't elaborate on the possibility of being it a performance, exactly to claim this cultural value, especially because the two people that you mentioned are overly educated. And I am pretty sure, there is, at least in the first case, the chance that this has not been a mistake and more of a performance. So I want you to reflect on that. There is a couple more comments and questions, so I will take them and then we'll get back to you. Ernesto and then Amy.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I think Amy was first, but if that is okay. I had I love the presentations. I had a bit of an issue trying to think myself, if I were to be placed in a scale, how populist I am. So I was thinking, are we defining, a duck? So you are a populist or you're not a populist, and therefore this is a state that corresponds with politicians? Because when I think about left and right, I know where I'm in the scale. And when I think about fascist and non-fascist, I know where I'm in the scale. But when I think about populism, everything seems to be, in politics, assimilation and contrast. I'm either close or far away, but I have no idea to what. So I had a question of to what extent we could place ourselves in the scales that we're describing. And if we cannot, then I'm not sure exactly what is it that we're defining as populism. So more of a thought experiment about, I'm not exactly sure how to place myself. I have some things in common with Peronism. I wouldn't call myself populist, but I'm not even sure Peronism is populism, going in line with what Vicky. So just as a general question, if rather than talking about Perón or Bolsonaro or Trump, we were to place ourselves in that scale, where would we fall? I'm not sure I'm in there.
Thank you, Ernesto. Amy, and then we'll get back, I guess, to...
Okay. Well, unexpectedly, my question answers Ernesto's question a bit. I didn't plan it that way. So first I wanted to mention, I recently read an article by two Brazilians, Mendonça and Caetano, Ricardo Mendonça and Renato Caetano, in the International Journal of Press and Politics, an article called Populism and Parody, Populism as Parody, the visual self-presentation of Jair Bolsonaro on Instagram. It's an article that develops an argument about how the visual representation of Bolsonaro becomes the embodiment of populism, that he manages through a visual representation of himself to transform himself into an everyman, and then by simultaneously sort of appropriating or using symbols of the presidency and of power, then sort of bringing power back to the people simultaneously. So he makes himself both like extremely ordinary by showing himself, hanging out in fancy meetings in a football jersey and things like that. And then simultaneously, so he brings the people into the presidential palace, and then he simultaneously brings power to the people through his visual images. It's a really interesting piece that has an implicit definition of what populism is. And one of the most interesting things I've read recently that helps me think about populism. So I think, to answer more directly Ernesto's question, I don't know that the definition of populism that emerges from all of these papers is one that's an individual level variable. I don't think it's something that could be measured in a survey in the way that you're asking about, Ernesto. And I think that's part of the problem here. I think I hear it emerging from across the various papers as a way of defining a leader and a way of defining the people, and defining the relationship between the leader and the people. And it's about constructing the definition of the people in a way that is self-serving for the leader, right? So I mean, this is Claudio's point. So it's a reconstruction of the concept of what the Mexican people is in light of the leader in a way that helps the leader maintain power. And that's effectively what's also going on with Jair Bolsonaro on Instagram. He's defining the people as himself and then defining himself as the people, bringing power to himself again. So that's all comments. My question is that there may be, I think there are probably different spaces that are better and worse for defining who the people are, different mechanisms for holding power, right? For a leader to assert who the people are. History classes, obviously, as Claudio points out, are one useful place to define the people. Internet memes is a really great place for Jair Bolsonaro to define who the people are because he has total control over the image and tremendous distributive power, or like power to distribute the message. And I think that relates to Cesar's point about symbolic redistribution. Jair Bolsonaro is symbolically redistributing power through Instagram. Graciela was talking about the streets. And it strikes me that the streets are not nearly so good a place for the populist leader to define the people. The streets are a place of confrontation. And the streets are a place where you can lose control of your message really easily. And it's going to get transformed and messed up. And especially I think in the contemporary era, it seems like a place which would be relatively unpropitious. And I'm curious about this tension because it seems like the streets have been so important to populism, but you can lose control of the streets so easily. So I'm just curious about that.
Okay, sorry, Agustina had a two finger that I didn't see through the chat, and then we'll get back to the panelist.
Yeah, just a very quick question, comment on what you mentioned earlier, Vicky, and this is also a reaction to Galia's presentation, which is the geography of populism. And so we typically tend to think of as populism as something that takes place in the city, right? But we have other ways of populism that take place in the rural areas. And Vicky, you were bringing up some examples of that. We have a word for that. That is the caudillo, right? So what to me defines the populist leader is someone who's trying to reach out to the oppressed. And the oppressed can be workers, they can be peasants, you name it. So I don't see populism as intrinsically related to the cities, right? It's true that it takes place there, but I see Menem as a classical example of populism in La Rioja, and we cannot speak of La Rioja as an urban setting. And then, of course, we should not forget about the coalition making of populism. And here we have Ernesto with his very seminal piece on the rural coalition of populism combined with the urban coalition of populism. So just to add that populism, at least in my understanding of populism, is not just an urban phenomenon. And the same thing with Trump. I mean, Trump was trying to reach out people that were not living in the cities. So the geography of populism, I think, is another dimension that we need to add and see how that has evolved over time.
Thank you, Agustina. Let's get back to the panelists so that they can react. Let's follow the same order. Claudio?
Thanks. Again, I'm not a theorist of populism, and I learned a lot from, say, what Federico said, and I think that's it's very useful. Getting to Alejandro's question, what I have thought about, and I wrote a piece about this a long time ago. Again, all of my writing about populism has been as op-ed writer rather than as an academic, is around the question of indignados. I think that all these movements have as their substratum a movement of some kind of indignation that emerged together with as a result of a number of the transformations that we associate with neoliberalism. But the thing about indignados I wrote in that paper is that there are two senses of, two kinds of dignities that are being, there's two forms of indignación that I think have very different kind of political valence. One is the people who lose rights, lose prerogatives, you know, are downwardly mobile, have been affected by the reforms and are fed up with the status quo. And the other are classes or social groups that have never really had access to the full rights of social rights, et cetera, of citizenship. And you have both of those in movements of indignados. And it seems to me that the political valence is very different, because in one case, the movement has a restorative dimension, and in the other, it has, I think, an emancipatory dimension. And whether any of these Latin American populist movements are dominated by one or the other of these kinds of indignados is, to me, an open question. I mean, I think that you've had a tremendous amount of downward mobility and a number of middle-class groups, former middle-class groups, or precariously middle-class groups that become extremely vocal in these populist movements. And they could go, I think, left or right, because part of what's at issue, I think, is the capture of the state. In that sense, I don't think that the issue is only about benefiting the leader, but really it is about the capture of the state, which is a very old Latin American problem. I mean, in the 19th century, they used to talk about empleomania, right? In the old days, right? In the 1830s, 1840s. So the capture of the state was an important dimension of the struggle between the liberals and the conservatives in the 19th century, because those were jobs. And getting certain kind of government jobs, I think, is a very important dimension of what we are calling populism. And so, but also with regard to expand, I do agree with the points of the people have said, Ken and also Alejandro, others, that these movements have something to do with the politicization of the economy. Although I would say that the politicization at the same time is to a large degree reduced by the act of polarizing. That is, the definition of the political field from populism reduces the terms of the politicization, or tries to, at least, tries its best to actually reduce it at the same time that it's politicizing. So the politicization of the economy, in principle, should lead in and of itself to some degree of expansion of rights, in the sense that claims can be made, right? And negotiations happen as opposed to when you don't have politicization. On the other hand, I would say it's not very clear to me that these movements end up strengthening the state the way they pretend to. And I think you have very weakened states often emerging from populist practice, including the authoritarian side of it, weakens the state. And if the state is weakened, its ability to actually make rights, translate rights into actual real material claims is lessened. So I think you have a kind of gesticulation, put it this way, or a kind of a sentimentalism, I would say, that emerges around rights in populist movements, whether they're in power or out of power. There's a huge expansion of rights, but that doesn't mean that the state is capable of delivering.
Vicky, yeah.
We have 17 minutes, so let's be sharing between the three of you, about 6 minutes each. Galia?
So I need less than that. So what I was going to say is that I'm not claiming that all protest or all populism emerges from cities, or I'm not saying that the plaza is a Latin American invention or a Latin American prerequisite. What I'm saying is that if you are, by comparison, if you are a citizen of Holland, if you live in Rotterdam, or if you live in Copenhagen, and you have a grievance, whether you live in the city or you live outside Copenhagen, you have many mechanisms to make your voice heard. And there's no need to put your body on the line and push in the way people need to push in Latin America. And I think that what happens in Latin America is that the emergency of the situation allows for the city to be the only vehicle or the most effective vehicle for these grievances to be heard. And I also want to expand the idea of violence. We think about violence in a way, but there's a lot of economical violence in Latin America, and hunger is a way of violence. And so I think like the politicization of the economy is a byproduct of the expansion of issues of debt and the economical difficulties. And so I think that this makes the city, if half of the world population lives in cities and the majority, and such a big part of the population of Latin America lives in city, it makes the city a clear venue for voicing those grievances. And the plaza, this void left in the center of the city, for fiestas originally in 1573, it's also a perfect receptacle for these, for voicing these pains. And then I also wasn't saying that all these, the cacerolazo, the piquete, the scratche are belong or originated at this time and in Argentina or Latin America. What I'm saying is that these are effective techniques. The urban piquete, the escracho, and the cacerolazo are effective techniques with the burning of flags, with the burning of monuments, with graffiti, with all these things to give voice to the people that do not have voice, and that we see these expanding in a in many ways as a non-violent alternative to access power.
Thank you, Galia. Graciela?
Well, there is a lot of things here, and I think we are talking about different phenomena. It's not the same Perón and Bolsonaro and Trump and AMLO. So for this reason, the national or the regional frame is important to me. And regarding the question, there are a lot of things, but I can answer first the Vicky and Cesar question about if Kicillof act is a performance or a mistake. I think it's not relevant if it's a mistake or is a performance, because the effect of this act is more important than the real intention of the Kicillof or Fernandez. I think we are thinking that this kind of acts are a sort of manipulation of the people. And I say no, it's not a manipulation, or maybe yes, but it's not different of the manipulation of the neoliberal government. So I think we can understand this act like a problematic form of interpellation of the people. It's very problematic, but from the cultural studies scholar point of view, this this business is good because we can see in this kind of phenomena the form that the people is interpolated and is integrated in the discussion. In the neoliberal government, people is not integrated in the discussion. So in this sense, I agree with Ken and others participants in regarding the repoliticization that this kind of government produce in the society. So I am, in my paper, I said, I can give a definition of the populism government, movement. I just understand how culture functions in some populist environment. So in this sense, the symbolic redistribution of populism, I think it's very, very important. It's a moment of repoliticization, the empower the people. So, but I insist, it's not the same Cristina Fernandez than Bolsonaro. It's not the same Chavez than Maduro. So we can understand the populism in Latin America and in the world as a problem, as a political and social and economical problem. But I am not sure if we can understand all these kind of phenomena in the same way. Maybe the populism is an umbrella to see a kind of relationship with the people, or as Claudio says, a capture of the state, or the place of the state in a political relationship, but there are different phenomena. So, well, I stop here.
Thank you, Graciela. This is great. Federico?
Yes, well, I agree with Graciela. And in fact, that's why I work on what I work. And I think this is part of a history. I mean, the point is like, what they have in common and what they don't have in common. And if you analyze like the different times and periods, then you can see, I mean, a couple of connections and of course, important disconnections. In the case, I mean, what I think it is, central to all this is that there are certain things that, I mean, it depends on what you want to focus on. But if you want to focus on what they have in common, I wouldn't say that, Trump and Christina Kirchner are the same, and yet they have in common a couple of things. They have in common their anti-liberalism, they have in common like other traits. Now, what is interesting is that what they don't have in common, and in that sense, someone like Christina Kirchner might be closer to Berlusconi than to Trump, is that, let's say from Perón to Kirchner and Berlusconi, they share a notion of the people, well, let's say with liberalism. I mean, the notion of the people, I mean, in most populisms is related to a concept of the people as demos. That is to say, the people are those that identify with the leader. In the cases of, Christina Kirchner, for example. Now, the people are those that can vote is a more liberal version, of course. In the case of Perón, the people that can vote and vote against him are the anti-people, el antipueblo. Now, what is interesting is that although there is that element of, let's say, a kind of big intolerance for minorities, and in this sense, Christina Kirchner is a very intolerant person, what you don't have is what kind of Bolsonaro and Trump recuperate from fascism, which is a notion of the people understood not only as a demos, but even perhaps more importantly, as an ethnos. So for Trump or Bolsonaro, the people are religious / particular ethnicity. So when you talk about his base, you don't probably think about people that are not looking that different to those that invaded the Capitol. So this kind of racist understanding of the people relates the new populists to fascism in ways that the older populists are not related at all. Now, I think Ken's point, Ken's question for me is the key question, which is to say, what is different and what is not? And in terms, as an historian, I will answer this historically, that throughout the history of populism, you see moments of demarcation in which the difference becomes quite qualitative, and in other moments, less so. I don't personally think that, the connection, let's say, between someone like Kirchner and fascism is important at all. It's not important at all in that sense. And yet in someone like Trump, you see moments in which the demarcation becomes so big that it becomes quite qualitative. Perón will say, to the enemies, not even justice. And to his enemies, he will say, we will crush them as snakes because they are not real people. And then he will do nothing. And in Trump, you don't see that distinction between, let's say, the rhetorical excesses of a violence that remains at the discursive level and the practice, which is, someone like AOC or many other of our representatives being at the point of almost being killed. And that is more fascist than populist in a way. So at the end of the day, it becomes a kind of very, someone like Paxton will say, that's it. The Capitol is the moment in which I will call them fascist. I am less interested in that moment, rather in thinking which are the things which makes populism closer to fascism and what is not. Now, regarding Ernesto's point, that is very interesting because I cannot avoid to be self-referential here because I have been working on this for decades. So when you were saying that, I said, okay, what do I say about this? And in my book, I present a list of 16 points of what I think populism was and has been in history. Now, the question then that you have, and in a way as an historian, I try to really get away from that question. I try to be really detached. I'm not that interested in my political opinions as an historian. But if I had to, and even if I go by my, by my scale, so to speak, like the question that you have to say is, for you, is the leader that important that you are willing to, let's say, forgive the leader's impersonation of the people and the state? Are you willing to believe that legitimacy is more important than legality? These are important issues in populism. Are you willing to think that the myth of the leader is more important than your own reason? For example, in the case of Christina Kirchner, there was an interesting example when she put like a person seriously accused of having violated, human rights during the dictatorship, General Milani, as the key leader in the army. There was an interesting, a Kirchnerist opinionator who wrote, I cannot understand why Christina is doing this, but I have to support because she's doing this. Okay, this is, of course, not only a part of the populist tradition. It was important in Stalinism and important in fascism, but I'm sure, Ernesto, you are not that kind of person. I don't know you well, but none of us is. Only a few people will try to detach their reason and ethics and understanding of legality in favor of the leader. Now, those that do that, they are more into the populist spectrum, if you will. But then again, there are other elements as well. Do you believe that national culture is one, or national thinking, pensamiento nacional is one, and all others that do not correspond to that kind of thinking are not legitimate enough as members of the people? These are the questions that in populism relate to certain ways. And yet, as I said, I don't want to generalize, because in my own work, I try to actually distinguish between movements, nations, and periods. Because at the end of the day, this is a history. And it's hard to say, like in the case, Alejandro, and this is the last, I would like to end with a kind of, with some, un comentario picante, with some spice. Like, it's very difficult to know where it's going. And as an historian, I know where it came from and what's going on, but I don't know where it's going. Historically, in most cases, populists, when they lose, they leave power. Correa did, Kirchner did, Perón did. And even Perón lost in illegal ways, and he decided not to fight. And he left because violence was something that was anathema to him. Now, in the case of Erdogan in Turkey, he didn't start as a populist. He became a populist, and he's now a dictator. The same you can say about Maduro, which in my opinion, as Graciela said, is very different to Chavez. Personally, my politics are as far away from them as they could be, but the point is I want to make that distinction because one is an elected leader and the other one is a person that cannot justify his rule in electoral terms, which is to say that he's a dictator. So the point is that in history, I mean, being a populist is not an essential category. In a way, it's a way of doing politics. And the last thing I want to say is that it's an understanding of politics, which is quite ideological. Because if one is to understand that the leader impersonates everything, and politics should be about delegation and not representation, and the separation of power is not that important, either left or right, that is a big ideological statement or position.
Thank you, Federico. That was a powerful ending to the panel. I want to thank everyone for having participated, to those that are on Facebook for hearing as well. This was a very robust discussion. I want to remember everyone that next Friday, we do not have a meeting of the conference. It will come again on February the 19th. And we will have Ken Roberts, Ernesto Calvo, Amy Erica Smith, and Eduardo Moncada in that panel. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to Monica and Esteban also for helping on the ILA side.